For months, Chinese negotiators had carefully buried their real intentions in 200 pages of legal text, but they never expected Ibrahim Traoré to discover the truth hidden on page 156 that would expose their entire African strategy. The conference room on the 15th floor of Ouagadougou's International Business Center had been transformed into the stage for what Chinese media was calling the deal of the century. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany tables arranged in a perfect square, with the flags of Burkina Faso and the People's Republic of China positioned strategically behind the main negotiating positions. Li Weichun, chairman of China's largest state-owned mining consortium, sat with the composed confidence of a man who had orchestrated similar agreements across 3 continents. His team of 12 negotiators, lawyers, and technical specialists flanked him in matching dark suits, their briefcases containing documents that had been meticulously crafted over 8 months of preparation. Across from them, Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the final contract one last time, his expression thoughtful but calm. The document before him represented the largest single foreign investment in Burkina Faso's history, $8 billion over 15 years for the development of newly discovered lithium deposits in the country's northern regions. The terms, as presented to the Burkinabe government and international media, appeared extraordinarily favorable. China would finance all infrastructure development, provide cutting-edge extraction technology, train local workers, and share 60% of profits with Burkina Faso. Environmental protections were guaranteed, and local communities would receive direct compensation for land use. President Traoré, Li Weichun said in fluent French, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from managing China's African investments worth over $200 billion. This agreement represents a new model of South-South cooperation. Unlike the exploitative relationships your country has endured with Western powers, this partnership will ensure that Africa's resources finally benefit African people. Traoré nodded appreciatively. The Chinese approach had indeed been refreshingly different from the conditional aid and structural adjustment programs imposed by Western institutions. There were no demands for democratic reforms, no requirements to privatize state-owned enterprises, no insistence on adopting Western legal frameworks. Mr. Li, Traoré replied, we appreciate China's respect for our sovereignty and your commitment to mutually beneficial development. This agreement could transform our nation's economic future. The formal signing ceremony was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. International media had been invited to witness what Chinese officials described as a landmark moment in Sino-African relations. The deal would establish a template for similar agreements across Africa, potentially reshaping the continent's relationship with global powers. But as Traoré began his final review of the 200-page document, his chief translator, Dr. Aminata Cohn, noticed something that made her blood run cold. Dr. Cohn had earned her doctorate in international law from Beijing University and had spent 5 years working for the African Union's legal department. Her expertise in Chinese legal terminology and her fluency in Mandarin had made her invaluable during the complex negotiations. But as she cross-referenced the Chinese and French versions of the contract, discrepancies began to emerge that chilled her to the bone. The Chinese delegation had insisted on including the original Mandarin text alongside French translations, claiming this would prevent misunderstandings. What they hadn't anticipated was that Dr. Cohn would notice subtle but crucial differences between the 2 versions. While the French text promised environmental protections and community benefits, the Chinese version used legal terminology that essentially voided these commitments. Where the French document guaranteed Burkina Faso's control over mining operations, the Chinese text included clauses that would transfer operational authority to Chinese administrators within 2 years. Most alarmingly, buried deep in the Chinese version's technical appendices, Dr. Cohn discovered language that would grant Chinese security forces the right to establish protected zones around mining sites, zones that would be governed by Chinese rather than Burkina Faso law. As she continued reading, the true scope of the deception became clear. This wasn't a partnership agreement. It was a carefully disguised annexation contract that would give China de facto control over nearly 40% of Burkina Faso's territory. Dr. Kona's hands trembled as she reached page 156, where the most devastating clause was hidden within dense legal language about dispute resolution mechanisms. The clause stipulated that any conflicts regarding the mining operations would be resolved through Chinese arbitration courts, effectively placing the entire project beyond Burkina Faso's legal jurisdiction. But there was more. Page 156 also contained a provision that would automatically extend the contract for additional 25-year periods if certain development benchmarks were not met. Benchmarks that were defined so vaguely that China could essentially claim permanent control over the mining regions. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Burkina Faso was about to sign away its sovereignty to China, just as it had struggled for decades to escape French neocolonial control. Dr. Cohn glanced toward the Chinese delegation, who were chatting amicably among themselves, confident that their carefully crafted deception would remain undetected. Li Weiqian was checking his phone, probably coordinating with Beijing officials, who were eager to announce this latest triumph in China's African expansion strategy. She needed to warn President Traoré immediately, but she couldn't create a scene that would alert the Chinese team to her discovery. The signing ceremony was minutes away, and international media were already setting up their cameras in the adjacent hall. Working quickly, Dr. Cohn drafted a brief note in French, highlighting the most critical discrepancies between the Chinese and French texts. She folded it carefully and waited for the right moment to pass it to Traoré without attracting attention. Li Weiqian stood up, signaling that it was time to move to the signing ceremony. "President Traoré, shall we proceed? The world is waiting to witness this historic partnership." As Traoré began to gather his documents, Dr. Cohn seized her opportunity. She approached him under the pretense of organizing his papers and slipped the note into his hand while whispering urgently, "Sir, please read this before signing anything." Page 156 specifically. Traoré's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked to the note. He glanced at Dr. Cohn, seeing the alarm in her face, then casually unfolded the paper, as if reviewing routine talking points. What he read made his blood run cold. "Mr. President, the Chinese version contains clauses not present in the French text. Page 156 grants China permanent territorial control and legal immunity. This is not a mining agreement. It's a colonization contract. The environmental protections and profit-sharing arrangements can be voided by Chinese administrators within 24 months. We are about to sign away our sovereignty." Traoré felt a surge of anger, but he maintained his diplomatic composure. The Chinese delegation was watching him, and any sign of suspicion could prompt them to withdraw the offer before he could fully understand what they were attempting. "Mr. Li," Traoré said calmly, "I'd like to review one final section before we proceed. As you know, in our democratic system, I must be absolutely certain of every detail before committing our nation to such an important agreement." Li Weiqian's smile faltered slightly. In his experience, African leaders rarely insisted on detailed contract reviews once the cameras were ready. Most were eager to sign and claim credit for securing Chinese investment. "Of course, Mr. President, but the media are waiting, and we have scheduled press conferences in Beijing and Brussels. This will only take a few minutes," Traoré replied, opening the contract to page 156. As he read the Chinese text alongside Dr. Kona's translation, the full scope of the deception became clear. The clause buried in page 156 wasn't just about dispute resolution. It established what amounted to Chinese extraterritorial rights within Burkina Faso. Chinese citizens working on the mining project would be subject only to Chinese law. Chinese security forces could operate freely within the designated zones. Most devastatingly, the contract could be unilaterally extended by China if they determined that Burkina Faso had failed to meet development targets that were deliberately set to be impossible to achieve. Traoré realized he was looking at a modern version of the 19th century unequal treaties that China itself had been forced to sign during the colonial period. The irony was bitter. China, having suffered under such agreements, was now imposing them on Africa. As he continued reading, Traoré discovered additional hidden clauses that would have given China control over Burkina Faso's foreign policy regarding the mining regions. Any international agreements affecting the lithium deposits would require Chinese approval. Even diplomatic relations with other countries could be restricted if China deemed them threatening to their mining interests. The document was a masterpiece of legal deception. Every exploitative clause was buried in technical language and cross-referenced across multiple sections, making it nearly impossible to understand the full implications without careful analysis by experts fluent in Chinese legal terminology. "Mr. President," Li Weiqian said, his voice carrying a note of impatience, "is there a particular concern we can address quickly? Our team has already accommodated numerous revisions during our negotiations." Traoré looked up from the contract, his expression unchanged, but his voice carrying a subtle edge. "Mr. Li, I'm curious about the discrepancies between the Chinese and French versions of the contract, specifically the language on page 156 regarding dispute resolution." The reaction from the Chinese delegation was immediate and telling. Several team members exchanged glances, and Li Weiqian's confident demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure what discrepancies you're referring to," Li Weiqian replied carefully. "Both versions contain identical provisions. Perhaps there's a translation issue we can clarify after the signing." But Traoré was already pointing to specific lines in the Chinese text. "This clause grants Chinese authorities jurisdiction over disputes that, in the French version, are subject to Burkina Faso law. And this section about contract extensions, the Chinese version includes automatic renewal provisions that aren't mentioned in the French text." The room fell silent. Dr. Cohn stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension. "Mr. Li, I have a doctorate in Chinese law from Beijing University. The discrepancies are not translation errors. They're deliberate alterations designed to give China rights, not disclosed, in the French version." Li Weiqian's mask of diplomatic courtesy began to slip. "Dr. Cohn, legal documents often contain technical language that can appear different when viewed out of context." "I'm not viewing anything out of context," Dr. Cohn interrupted. "Page 156 establishes Chinese extraterritorial rights that would make portions of Burkina Faso subject to Chinese rather than Burkina Faso law. Page 47 gives Chinese security forces operational authority that supersedes our national sovereignty. Page 89 allows China to unilaterally extend the contract indefinitely." The Chinese delegation erupted in urgent whispers. Li Weiqian raised his hand for silence, his diplomatic veneer now completely abandoned. "President Traoré, I think there may be some misunderstanding about standard international mining contract provisions." "No misunderstanding," Traoré replied, closing the contract firmly. "This document doesn't establish a partnership. It establishes Chinese colonial control over our territory. We won't be signing today." The effect was electric. Li Weiqian's face darkened, and his team began frantically collecting their documents. "President Traoré, you're making a serious mistake. China has invested considerable resources in developing this agreement. Walking away now would have significant consequences for Burkina Faso's future development prospects." The threat was barely disguised. Traoré had heard similar warnings from French officials when he had nationalized mining operations previously controlled by Western companies, but he also knew that China's African strategy depended on maintaining the fiction of win-win cooperation. Overt retaliation would damage their carefully cultivated image as Africa's benevolent development partner. "Mr. Li," Traoré said, standing to signal the meeting's end, "China has indeed invested considerable resources in this agreement. Perhaps too much effort was spent on legal creativity rather than honest partnership." As the Chinese delegation prepared to leave, Dr. Cohn approached Traoré with another document she had been reviewing. "Sir, I've found evidence that similar hidden clauses have been included in Chinese agreements with at least 6 other African countries. This appears to be a systematic strategy." The implications were staggering. If China had successfully implemented such contracts across Africa, they would have gained de facto control over vast territories rich in strategic minerals. It would represent the largest territorial expansion by any power since the colonial era, achieved through legal deception rather than military conquest. Traoré made a decision that would reshape Africa's relationship with China. "Dr. Cohn, prepare a comprehensive analysis of this contract and any similar agreements you can identify. We're going to share our findings with the African Union and every African leader who might be considering similar deals with China." Over the following weeks, Dr. Koh's analysis revealed the scope of China's deceptive contracting strategy. Similar hidden clauses had been buried in agreements across Africa, from copper mines in Zambia to oil fields in Angola. In each case, African governments had been presented with seemingly favorable terms, while the Chinese versions contained provisions that would gradually transfer sovereignty to China. The revelation sent shockwaves through African capitals. Several countries immediately launched reviews of their Chinese contracts, discovering similar discrepancies. The African Union convened an emergency session to address what officials called the most serious threat to African sovereignty since formal colonization. China's response was swift and defensive. Beijing recalled Li Weiqian and issued statements claiming that Burkina Faso had misunderstood standard international commercial practices. But the damage was done. African leaders, who had previously praised China's respectful approach to African sovereignty, began questioning whether they had been naive about Chinese intentions. The incident sparked a continent-wide movement for contract transparency. African governments began requiring that all international agreements be reviewed by independent legal experts fluent in the original languages. Several countries established specialized departments to analyze foreign contracts for hidden sovereignty transfer clauses. 6 months later, at an African Union summit in Addis Ababa, Traoré addressed fellow African leaders about the dangers of economic colonization through legal deception. The agreement we almost signed would have given China control over 40% of our territory, he told the assembled presidents and prime ministers. They called it partnership, but the fine print revealed it as conquest. We must remember that sovereignty lost through contracts is just as devastating as sovereignty lost through war. The speech received a standing ovation and led to the establishment of the African Contract Review Initiative, a continental body dedicated to protecting African sovereignty from legal exploitation. Li Weiqian, meanwhile, found his career trajectory significantly altered. The failure of the Burkina Faso operation, combined with the broader exposure of China's deceptive contracting practices, led to his reassignment to a less prominent position in China's foreign investment bureaucracy. The incident became a case study in diplomatic schools worldwide, illustrating how legal deception could be more dangerous than military aggression in the modern era. It also demonstrated the importance of having competent legal expertise during international negotiations. For Dr. Cohn, her role in exposing the Chinese deception earned international recognition. She was appointed as the African Union's first Director of Contract Security, charged with helping African governments identify and resist economic colonization attempts. As for Traoré, the decision to reject $8 billion in immediate investment was initially criticized by some domestic opponents who accused him of prioritizing ideology over development. But as the full scope of what China had attempted became clear, his decision was vindicated. Burkina Faso eventually secured alternative development funding from a consortium of countries that respected its sovereignty. The lithium mines were developed under agreements that genuinely shared profits and control with the Burkina Faso government, proving that development didn't require surrendering independence. The story of page 156 became a cautionary tale across Africa, a reminder that the most dangerous threats to sovereignty often came disguised as generous offers of partnership. It reinforced the lesson that in international relations, as in personal relationships, offers that seemed too good to be true usually were. Years later, when asked about the moment he discovered the hidden clauses, Traoré would reflect on how close his country had come to peaceful conquest. They almost succeeded because they understood our desperation for development, he would say. But they underestimated our commitment to freedom. No amount of money is worth losing your soul as a nation. The conference room, where the failed signing was to have taken place, was later converted into a training center for African diplomats, with page 156 of the Chinese contract displayed in a frame as a permanent reminder of the vigilance required to maintain African independence in an era of economic warfare. The crystal chandeliers still cast their warm light, but now they illuminated discussions about protecting African sovereignty rather than surrendering it. The mahogany tables that once nearly witnessed the signing of Burkina Faso's economic colonization now hosted seminars on contract analysis and legal self-defense. And somewhere in Beijing, in the archives of China's African Investment Ministry, The failed Burkina Faso contract served as its own kind of reminder, evidence that Africa's new generation of leaders would not be as easy to deceive as their predecessors, and that the era of unopposed exploitation of African resources, whether by East or West, was finally coming to an end.